An extremely important discussion on protecting the most vulnerable members of our population. Through the 118th Congress, our subcommittee held 2 victims-focused hearings. We passed 2 pieces of legislation out of committee, and one of them ended up being signed into law. I look forward to continuing this work in the 119th Congress by spotlighting how to best protect victims of human trafficking and child exploitation and give a voice to these countless victims. Human trafficking, specifically sex trafficking, is a heinous crime that tragically continues to grow in America. While international sex trafficking may be more widely known, domestic sex trafficking also persists in the United States. Traffickers even use social media to lure innocent people, including children, to become victims. In the United States, an adult or child can be trafficked and exploited at hotels, truck stops, their own homes, and online. Trafficking victims are exploited in cities, suburban, and rural areas. It can happen anytime and anywhere. Traffickers use fraud, force, and coercion to induce their victims to commit crimes. This can lead to the arrest, conviction, and incarceration of trafficked victims without consideration of their victim status. Thankfully, we as a country have and will continue to make significant progress to help victims and survivors move forward with their lives. We're also committed to protecting children and combating the growing issue of child sexual abuse material, CSAM. Identifying children depicted in CSAM is crucial to stop their ongoing victimization and capture offenders of producing it. More than 50,000 children in CSAM videos and images in the possession of law enforcement remain unidentified. It's tragic that so many children remain unknown, unfound, and unrescued. Last year, the committee worked with former members of Homeland Security Investigations, the main investigative body within DHS, and the prominent law enforcement agency combating human trafficking and child exploitation. We also heard from current and former Internet Crimes Against Children, ICAC, task force officers coordinating thousands of federal, state, and local enforcement agencies across the country combating CSAM. We also had powerful testimony from Tim Tebow, sharing the mission of the Tim Tebow Foundation and more about Operation Renewed Hope. Operation Renewed Hope is the first of its kind. It's joining federal law enforcement agencies with non-government organizations to identify, locate, and rescue victims of child exploitation. Thanks to these heroic efforts, over 300 victims were identified and at least 14 were rescued. I understand Operation Renewed Hope is ongoing, and I hope more victims continue to be rescued and provided with the care they need and deserve. There is no question these criminals must be prosecuted. While there are many solutions to combat these issues, we must assure prosecutors are doing their jobs to put these criminals behind bars. I express my gratitude to the special agents of HSI and ICAC task force officers for their unwavering commitment to safeguarding children and liberating victims from the atrocities of these crimes. I also thank NCMEC and the Tim Tebow Foundation. These groups are leading the charge to identify and rescue victims of human trafficking and CSAM, and for that we thank you. Sunshine's the best disinfectant, it has been said. It is the best way to rid the world of these predators who abuse and exploit victims. We will continue our work to deliver hope to those who need it most. Again, I thank those witnesses who are here and the members of the committee who are here and will come. And with that, I yield back and now recognize the ranking member, Ms. McBath, for her opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to all of our witnesses this morning. Thank you to each of you for joining us today for our first hearing of the Subcommittee on Crime and Federal Government Surveillance in the 119th Congress. I welcome all of our subcommittee members, as Chairman said, that will also be arriving, and I truly hope that we can find common ground this Congress as we work to combat crime and make our communities safer. Most Americans probably think that we've never met a victim of human trafficking or online exploitation, that these crimes happen everywhere else. But the unfortunate reality is that more than 36 million reports of online child sexual exploitation were made in 2023, while reports of online enticement increased more than 300% in just 2 years. And human trafficking, a multi-billion-dollar industry that includes both sex trafficking and labor trafficking, has been reported in all 50 states. Before I became a member of Congress, believe it or not, I was a flight attendant. And I was trained to spot the signs of trafficking on board the airline, the planes. We were taught that if we saw someone in distress, we would reach out and help that person find safety if we could. This training continues today through the Department of Homeland Security's Blue Campaign, which educates people in key industries and the public to help identify victims of trafficking. But what happens after that victim is discovered, whether by a flight attendant, a doctor, a hotel manager, a friend, or a member of the community, what happens after that? Almost 25 years ago, Congress recognized that to combat human trafficking effectively, a system was needed that could help victims escape, get the support that they needed, and if they were willing, aid law enforcement in prosecuting their trafficker. With the help of trafficking advocates, Congress's solution was the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, a bipartisan bill that invested in prevention, protection of victims, and prosecutions. But today, the entire system is in jeopardy. The current administration's chaotic and reckless approach to governing has put lives on the line by freezing funding and stopping the very critical work done by organizations that help victims and help survivors. These disruptions have already forced nonprofits to lay off employees. And while some organizations have had their funding restored, they still worry about how this administration might continue to undermine their work. If the president continues down this path and funding is cut for good, it will be trafficking victims and survivors who pay the price. Without shelters, where will these victims and survivors go? Without lawyers or social workers, who will advocate for them to make sure that they get the services that they need? Without assurances of safety, how will victims work with law enforcement in pursuing charges that might prevent a trafficker from reaching new victims? If this administration lets the system fail, victims will have nowhere to turn. And that is exactly what traffickers want. When victims feel like they have nowhere to go, traffickers can promise them safety, then turn on them to resume their exploitation. Now, I'm sure that there may be some out there who still think that this issue doesn't affect them. But the reality is that human trafficking and online exploitation, both in the United States and abroad, it harms all Americans. When the administration attempted to illegally dismantle USAID and froze State Department funding, U.S. anti-trafficking efforts were stopped around the world, efforts that protect Americans and the United States' interests. For example, USAID has been working to combat online operations in South Asia known as scam farms, which use forced labor to scam Americans. Democrats and Republicans have long been able to work together to combat human trafficking and online exploitation. At this moment, and I believe this is possible, but at this moment, we need our Republican colleagues to stand with us in calling on the administration to stop the chaos and stop the disruptions. Join us in protecting these very vital programs and organizations and their funding so that we can truly protect the victims and survivors of these reprehensible crimes. Now is not the time for us to cut off funding for law enforcement and safety reforms and safety efforts. Funding is absolutely necessary to combat these egregious crimes. And I yield back.
Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. And I'm going to now introduce today's witnesses, and I appreciate you coming today. Starting with Ms. Jean Brugman. Ms. Brugman is the Executive Director of Freedom Network USA, a collection of advocates and survivors that advocate for and provide services to trafficking survivors. She previously served as a Human Trafficking Fellow in the DOJ Office for Victims of Crime. Also is Ms. Basham. Ms. Ann Basham is the founder and chair of the Interparliamentary Task Force on Human Trafficking. The task force is a consortium of members of Parliament and Congress, government leaders, and survivors from more than 25 countries who work to stop human trafficking. Ms. Camille Cooper serves as Vice President of Anti-Human Trafficking and Child Exploitation at the Tim Tebow Foundation. She's worked for over 20 years on issues including child protection, child exploitation, and child trafficking. She previously served for 13 years as the Director of Government Affairs at the National Association to Protect Children, a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting children from abuse, neglect, and exploitation. And Ms. Sherry Lopez is a survivor of human trafficking and founder of Pearl at the Mailbox, a nonprofit organization that works to end child exploitation through prevention, education, and awareness. Her nonprofit is named for the woman who noticed that she was being trafficked and helped Sherry get free from her traffickers. We welcome our witnesses and thank them for appearing today. We'll begin by swearing you in. Would you each please rise and raise your right hand? Do you each swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? The record will reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you. Please be seated. Please know that your written testimony will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, we ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. Ms. Basham, we'll go to you first.
Thank you so much, Chairman Biggs, Ranking Member McBath, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Ann Basham, as he mentioned, and while there are many important relevant bills here in Congress right now, I am going to be focusing primarily on 2, and that is the Trafficking Survivor Relief Act and the Gracie Act. Human trafficking is perhaps the worst human rights violation in the world, and yet instead of receiving protection and justice, many trafficking victims are arrested and convicted of crimes they were forced to commit. Survivors of human trafficking too often have their voices silenced by unjust felony convictions for crimes they committed as a direct result, I should restate, of their trafficking offenses. Traffickers often force their victims to commit crimes, and the resulting criminal records prevent survivors from obtaining housing, employment, and other essential elements for life. Currently, most states have legal mechanisms that allow survivors of trafficking to seek vacatur or expungement of their criminal records that are tied to their exploitation. However, there is no equivalent legal framework at the federal level. The Trafficking Survivor Relief Act, or TSRA as I'm going to refer to it, is sponsored by Representative Fry, Liu, and Wagner, and it actually passed through the House Judiciary Committee last year. It seeks to address this gap by providing a pathway for survivors to vacate convictions and expunge arrest records for certain crimes that were a direct result of their trafficking. Additionally, the bill allows for the Office on Violence Against Women to allocate funding for civil legal services and establishes, and this is very important, an affirmative defense for victims so that they can avoid unjust criminalization at the outset. In an appendix to my written testimony, which I would really encourage you to read, I have included survivor impact statements, including the story of Holly Nadell, who built an incredible career and was acknowledged as a trafficking survivor by the court. But she recently lost everything due to a wrongful felony conviction. What is most alarming is that for most of these adults who are convicted in their late teens or early 20s, this experience began actually when they were children. Research shows that the average age at which children are targeted for both sex and labor trafficking is just 11 to 14 years old. And more than 60% of child trafficking victims are current or former foster youth. The Gracie Act, which is Generate Recordings of All CPS Interviews Everywhere, was just introduced last week by Senator Blackburn and Senator Ossoff. And it incentivizes states to mandate audio or video recordings for all Child Protective Services or CPS interviews. It also provides necessary transparency and accountability to those who are on the front lines of protecting children. So I'm actually going to share with you the story that inspired the Gracie Act. Abby, as I'm going to refer to her, was a young girl. She was caught in a nightmare that too many children face. Her parents were divorced, and during a visit to her father's house, a quarrel escalated into physical violence, and this was a young child in elementary school. Abby's father grabbed her neck, the incident was reported to a counselor, and the case was referred to CPS. The caseworker actually interviewed Abby at her mother's home because school happened to be closed that day for snow. That's very typical. The mother listened to the story from the next room and recorded the interview. The mother told the Abby told the investigator the same story she had told the counselor. However, the case was curiously dismissed. Months after the case closed, it was discovered that the official report distorted Abby's testimony, downplaying the assault as a mere grab to the arm, not the neck, an act which could have qualified as a felony under state law. Abby's voice was silenced. In the United States, 37.4% of children, that's more than 1/3 of all children, will be interviewed by CPS by the time they're 18. And without recordings, these children's testimonies can be easily misrepresented. So I actually have here a copy of the congressional record. I know that you all know what this looked like, but for everyone else, this is just one day on the House floor. This is everything that was spoken. But what if you as members of Congress went to the House floor and you gave an important testimony and it was never recorded? What if there was only one witness in the hearing room, not a stenographer, but just an observer who recorded a personal analysis of your testimony? Would you take this personal analysis as an accurate record of your testimony? Do you want the most important statements of your life to be at the mercy of a stranger with a pen? So the lack of transparency and accountability within child welfare systems is appalling. Police are required to wear body cameras in most states, and the Department of Justice has mandated interrogation recordings since Eric Holder. But child victims are not afforded the same protections. So thank you so much. With that, I urge each of you to co-sponsor both of these bills, as well as the National Human Trafficking Database Act, the Crime Victims Fund Stabilization Act, the SHIELD Act, the Renewed Hope Act, and the Take It Down Act. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Basham. Chair now recognizes Ms. Brugman for your 5-minute statement. Your microphone, please.
Thank you. Chairman Biggs, Ranking Member McBath, members of the committee and staff, and my fellow witnesses, thank you for the opportunity to discuss human trafficking in the United States. I'm Jean Brugman, Executive Director of Freedom Network USA, and an attorney with 25 years of experience addressing human trafficking. Freedom Network USA is the nation's largest coalition of anti-trafficking programs and a training and technical assistance expert. Our 98 members are NGOs and individuals. They are survivors, attorneys, researchers, teachers, doctors, and social service providers who work with over 6,000 trafficking survivors here in the United States every year. I've provided detailed recommendations in my written statement and will summarize those briefly now. Human trafficking is the result of policy choices. Industries like agriculture and domestic work, once dependent on enslaved labor, were left out of U.S. labor protections and are now rife with labor trafficking. Our immigration laws were established to exclude Asians and Africans. The criminalization of sex work was rooted in opposition to mixed-race couples. Enacting policies that protect all workers, value immigrants, and decriminalize sex work robs traffickers of their power. Young people are vulnerable to trafficking due to their developing brains and legal and physical dependence. If you add in poverty, insecure immigration status, sexual or physical abuse, or rejection by family or community, traffickers will swoop in. Providing care and support to all young people, including education on consent and healthy relationships, protects them from a range of abuse, and creates safe places to seek help. The internet, social media, and cryptocurrencies are being used by traffickers, but also by survivors and providers. While we need safer online spaces, restricting access to information and shutting down sites with adult content only drives traffickers into hidden spaces out of the reach of legal authorities. Age and identity restrictions collect data that hackers steal, and far too many policies are used to block access to critical information and safety for queer communities. We need to pursue policies that protect everyone, not just a few. Both labor and sex trafficking survivors are left with criminal records as a result of their victimization. Our Survivor Reentry Project is currently supporting 137 survivors who have a total of 1,716 criminal charges. We're connecting them with pro bono attorneys in the 47 states that have criminal record relief, but for those with federal charges, there are no options. Enacting the Trafficking Survivors Relief Act is critical, but we must avoid the pitfalls we've seen in so many state statutes. It must include a broad range of criminal charges, reduced requirements, and meet the needs of real survivors. Over 25 years, the TVPA has remained impressively bipartisan. Funding for services has steadily grown, but let's be honest, still not that much. FY24 appropriations for the DOJ and HHS programs combined were only about $120 million. But they provide survivors with safe housing, medical and mental health care, legal services, and education. These programs not only meet the very real needs of survivors, but they also send a critical message. We see you. You did not deserve this abuse, and we will protect you. But last month's OMB memo threatened to end all funding in less than 48 hours. The HHS grants were on hold for weeks. Programs funded by the State Department and USAID, both in the U.S. and abroad, have been canceled. Some programs have already enacted furloughs, halted hiring, or stopped accepting clients. If funding is not reliable, programs will close. Survivors will have to choose between staying with traffickers and homelessness, between abuse and hunger. Funding cuts enable traffickers to abuse and exploit U.S. citizens and foreign nationals alike. Traffickers target the vulnerabilities of their victims. To combat them, we can't use a one-size-fits-all approach. We must meet the specific needs of each person. The executive orders on gender, DEI, and immigrants threaten this critical work. Guidance from the federal government to ignore gender identity and sexual orientation tells queer communities that they are not welcome in these programs. Eliminating services for undocumented immigrants leaves them dependent on the traffickers who control their visas and their debts back home. These orders are a blank check to traffickers and will lead to increased violence and abuse. Most anti-trafficking programs are embedded in community-based organizations like refugee resettlement agencies, runaway and homeless youth shelters, and queer community centers. They are a part of the fabric of our social safety net, and strengthening that net holds the key to not only supporting survivors, but preventing human trafficking in America.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Ms. Lopez for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Biggs, Ranking Member Macbeth, and members of the committee. I am honored to testify before you today on protecting victims of human trafficking and online exploitation. My name is Sherry Lopez, and I am a human trafficking survivor and founder of the nonprofit Pearl at the Mailbox, named in honor of a brave woman who rescued me from 7 years of trafficking at a mailbox. I share with you today's survivor's point of view. I grew up in a stable, two-parent home. I had just turned 15 and was trying to find my place in the world. I was an insecure and shy teen, which made me vulnerable to manipulation. I share this to shatter the preconceived notion that most children trafficked come from broken homes, are troubled, or are runaways. I was none of these. The reality is that any child can be groomed and trafficked. I met a boy in the drama club in high school, and he quickly introduced me to his father. Throughout 3 months, he groomed me and became my first trafficker. This began my 7 years of being sex trafficked. From the age of 15 to 18, I lived at home, and my parents had no idea what was happening to me, and I could not find the words to tell them that I was repeatedly being raped. This continued on the weekend and over the summer while I was in high school. There are many times I tried to stop what was happening. However, every rape had been recorded and used as blackmail to force me into submission, along with other threatening actions that were messages to me to comply. From the age of 18 until my rescue, I was flown across the United States and forced to do things I didn't want to do, but did because of fear of the consequences. And traveling on airplanes, nobody would have ever known I was a trafficking victim. Over time, my body operated on autopilot while I emotionally checked out to cope with the trauma. During my 7 years of being trafficked, I had 4 traffickers. One was a woman. See, a trafficked person has a shelf life. Once they are no longer useful to the trafficker is going to get rid of them, which could include being sold to another trafficker, such in my case, kicked out, resulting in many homeless teens, or they're going to be killed. Traffickers intentionally set out to destroy the will, heart, and soul of their victim and would not hesitate to take their life too if needed. When a victim gives up on life and their will to live is destroyed, the brain goes into self-preservation mode to keep the heart beating, even if the victim would rather die to end the abuse. Survival is in our DNA. Traffickers know this and use fear to gain and maintain control of their victim, beat down the will to live, and use the victim however it best fits the agenda of the trafficker. Human trafficker survivors are often the pawns of crimes masterminded by the traffickers and seen as throwaways who can take the blame. Many times human traffickers are labeled as domestic violence victims and inadequately represented legally and therefore easy to convict, a box that can be checked and a person to put behind bars, while the trafficker can afford better legal representation and receive a lesser charge or accountability for their role in forcing another person to participate in what they orchestrated. And let me share with you that it took over 25 years for me to grasp even what happened to me, to be able to put a name to it, and then it was anger that another person had the right to abuse another person in such fashion that I finally had to speak up. And now you cannot keep me quiet. I found my place in legislation. Last year, with the help of Representative Gress, I was able to get the Arizona vacator law updated and signed by the governor, which gives human trafficking survivors charged with prostitution or minor criminal offenses the ability to meet with a judge and potentially get those charges set aside. Also, I participated in a group with the help of Representative Bliss, Senator Bullock, and the guidance of Representative Wynn, which was Prop 313. And it was created by the Arizona voters on the ballot, and it was passed unanimously in the state. And what this does is it allows any adult who traffics a child under 15 is convicted with the charge will spend the rest of their natural life in prison without the possibility of parole. Why is this important? Because a traffic survivor has a life sentence themselves. I will never get away from what happened to me. The life I had before is now gone. I respectfully ask that you support the Trafficking Survivors Relief Act. Doing so will give survivors hope that they can go forward and have a new life. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair recognizes now Ms. Cooper for your 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Biggs, Ranking Member McBath, and honorable members of the committee, thank you for having me back to speak again. My name is Camille Cooper, and I'm Vice President of Anti-Human Trafficking and Child Exploitation at the Tim Tebow Foundation. The Tim Tebow Foundation exists to bring faith, hope, and love to those needing a brighter day in their darkest hour of need. Our anti-human trafficking efforts span 52 countries around the globe. You have a few great bills before you this Congress: the Strengthening Child Exploitation Enforcement Act, the Protect Our Children Act reauthorization, the SHIELD Act, the Trafficking Survivors Relief Act, and Representative Smith's reauthorization of TVPRA. For today, I'm going to focus most of my attention on the Renewed Hope Act, which addresses the need to identify and safeguard the 57,000 unknown children seen in crime scene photos that depict their rape and torture. Chairman Biggs and Representative Laura Lee, thank you for your leadership and your assistance with that bill. 10 years ago, in a small town, a man started raping his 2-year-old stepdaughter. For our purposes, I'm going to call her Jane Doe. He filmed that abuse and shared it online with other pedophiles. The girl repeatedly disclosed her abuse, but she was not believed. For this little girl, the boogeyman was real, and he lived down the hall. For 10 years, Jane Doe suffered. In 2020, the number of children in the U.S. like Jane Doe that had their abuse images in the possession of law enforcement but had yet to be identified and safeguarded was 11,000. In 2022, the anecdotal information put that number at 20,000. In just 2 years, it had almost doubled. When I got to TTF, we put the protection of those children as our #1 priority, and we got to work. With the help of Timmy, John Rouse, Jim Cole, and the entire team at TTF, we hatched a plan. Bring all the experts in the world together with the goal of determining how many unknown victims were in the global image database at Interpol and operationalize a plan to find them. The result of that meeting led Homeland Security Investigations to create the first ever victim identification task force in the United States and dubbed it Operation Renewed Hope. In the summer of 2023 and the winter of 2024, this task force tentatively identified over 730 children, including Jane Doe. To date, 289 of those children have been confirmed safeguarded. Almost half were American children. Operation Renewed Hope 3 is currently underway as we speak. Based on current data of actively traded series identified at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, we know that family members are the largest category of offender in actively traded series, and of those, fathers produce more child sexual abuse images than any other type of offender category. According to law enforcement, children can be heard in these videos screaming for daddy to stop. In a study of unidentified victims of the Interpol database, they found that 84% of the images were of actual child sexual abuse, 47% contained extreme abuse, including rape, bondage, torture, defecation, and even bestiality. 4.3% of the images were infants. Due to the nature of online distribution, international collaboration with Interpol is essential in identifying and safeguarding American children. By way of example, the offender in Arizona rapes his child, films it, shares it with offenders in Spain or Germany. When those countries make an arrest and seize that offender's devices and analyze the images, they will find new victims, and those new victims' images go to Interpol's International Child Sexual Exploitation database. Since its inception, 14,000 children, or almost half of the identified images in the ICSA database, have been American children, and this is why collaboration is so critical. If half of the unidentified children in Interpol's database are likely American victims, that means that a team of 7 at HSI's Cybercrime Center are tasked with finding tens of thousands of American victims. And that's why the Renewed Hope Act is critical. It will increase that full-time workforce from 7 to 200. Despite the success of Operation Renewed Hope, we cannot leave these remaining 56,000 children to languish. They need intervention, and they need it quickly. When Jane Doe was protected, this is what she said. When the police arrived at my house, I felt happy. I felt that something good will happen for me. God, I was thrilled. I wanted to smile because I knew something good will happen. It was magic. Today, the fate of 56,000 children is in your hands. Thank you for allowing me to speak.
Thank you, Ms. Cooper, and thank all of our witnesses for their opening statements. Mr. Raskin, are you ready to go? So, Mr. Raskin, we recognize you for your opening statement.
Thank you very kindly for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman, and greetings to our witnesses. Thank you for your testimony, which I know is harrowing and difficult in some cases, and I thank you for your public service. Trafficking is modern-day slavery, and it reflects a time of cruelty and barbarity when everything is for sale, not just public office and government, but human beings, people, women, children, laborers. And we know that labor trafficking, sex trafficking, the child sex abuse material are all flourishing online. Alas, the social media companies have been pushed to remove all guardrails against objectionable content on their platforms, which is called censorship. the result has not been a free speech utopia, but a dystopian nightmare. Social media has become a cesspool of scams targeting the elderly, cyberbullying aimed at children and linked to escalating suicide rates, misinformation exploiting the victims of disasters, natural and unnatural, racist and anti-Semitic hatred and vilification, and foreign disinformation and propaganda undermining democratic elections and social trust. And all of this has been a boon for the sex traffickers, while reduced content moderation has also led to an explosion of child sex abuse material online. So we want to prevent the government from becoming a barren hellscape like the social media platforms have become. We cannot allow them to dismantle the government programs and federal funding that actually protect children and teens and aid the victims of human trafficking. We rely on law enforcement and personnel from Homeland Security, the FBI, the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force program, which is a national network of 61 different task forces to target the people that are preying on children and women. Just last week, we learned that the Department of Homeland Security has ordered its entire investigative division, 6,000 agents, to stop focusing on drug dealers, terrorists, and human traffickers, and instead prioritize, you guessed it, immigration enforcement. So the child pornographers, the drug networks, and the human traffickers must be uncorking their champagne bottles about the diversion of all the other law enforcement resources to work on the mass roundup and deportation of immigrants. So we've got an entire ecosystem of groups working to help here. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which receives 81% of its funding from the federal government, it does an essential job without federal funding and not-for-profits, and there are people determined to dismantle the federal funding. NCMEC and those that support victims by providing housing, emergency shelter, food, clothing, and so on, may have a much more difficult time being able to find the victims and survivors, the people who are willing to cooperate with investigations and prosecutions. My bottom line is I want to thank you for everything that you all are doing, and I hope that we will invest carefully in the public programs and the funded not-for-profit programs that are actually working to confront this nightmare in our time. I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize myself for my 5 minutes. Ms. Brugman, you're the Executive Director of Freedom Network, and so I assume you're familiar with your organization's finances and budget.
That's correct.
And will you please share with the committee the dollar amount Freedom Network received in grants from the federal government in 2023, please? If you don't have an exact number.
I don't have the exact number in front of me. I think that was in my disclosure form. We do have currently 3 grants and 1 sub-award. They're 3-year awards, so the funding is received but is to be used over the course of 3 years.
Yeah, and the 990 indicates that you received about $1.3 million, and that was about 87.7% of your funding.
That's correct.
Is that accurate?
That sounds like accurate.
So let's put those up. So you're getting nearly 90% of what you do funded by American taxpayers, and you advocate for legalization of prostitution. Is that fair?
We advocate for the decriminalization, Mr. Biggs. It is not the same as legalization.
And you also advocate for open borders, right?
We advocate for a safe way to allow migrants to move, to attain safety and support for themselves and their children, yes.
And so I have here a document from the National Center on Sexual Exploitation that protests your testimony today. because the legalization or full decriminalization of commercial sex does two things: expands the trade, thereby expanding the demand for more prostitution, typically satisfied by manipulating vulnerable people, including youth and those experiencing poverty, homelessness, addiction, and undocumented status. And two, it prevents law enforcement from being able to identify sex trafficking victims, including minors. And so without objection, I introduce this letter and the packet from the National Center on Sexual Exploitation.
I would argue that.
There's no question for you right now, Ms. Brugman. I'll go now to you, Ms. Lopez. The vacatur statute in Arizona that you worked on with Representative Gress in Arizona, that was to protect victims of trafficking who sometimes get caught up with committing crimes themselves. And so I wanted you to explain that and how you got that through.
Thank you for the question, Chairman Biggs. Yes, I like to find laws that are completely outdated and useless when it comes to protecting survivors. And the vacatur law was one of those in Arizona. It had an effective date of crimes prior to like 1987, something. So I presented it to Representative Gress, and I said, we need to update this because the issue that we have currently are survivors that were charged with prostitution because somehow automatically at the age of 18, somehow you're consenting to what's happening to you when you're really being trafficked. So you're charged with prostitution or some other petty crime, which is not uncommon for those that are hungry and the trafficker is controlling their aspects of eating or drinking, so they steal food to eat. And being able to update this law, which was supported unanimously through the House and the Senate on both sides, and now it allows survivors who have these charges to be able to fill out a form and request to meet with the judge and hopefully get those set aside so that way they can apply for background checks. Of course,
Then they get a clear record and they can live a normal life after that,
well,
to a certain
yes.
extent.
Yeah, with the vacatur law, it's not expungement, so they still show up on a fingerprint clearance card.
Right.
Absolutely. Somehow catch up. Yes, but they can go on. It gives them hope. Somebody who maybe wants to be a teacher can now apply to be a teacher. Somebody who wants to be a nurse, such in my case, I became a nurse and I was able to do that.
Thank you for that, and I know that there's additional work to be done on Arizona's law as well, so we'll be talking about that. I want to go to you, Ms. Basham, for a moment. So human trafficking, child trafficking, that happens across border as well.
Correct.
So when you have misplaced 330,000 plus children, which the previous administration did through its ORR programs, those children, some being placed in sponsors who were running strip clubs, dozens going to the same address, same person without vetting, that makes them more vulnerable to human and sex trafficking.
Absolutely, yes.
My time has expired. Appreciate that. And I'm going to recognize now the ranking member, Ms. McBath, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In a memorandum dated January 27th, 2025, the Office of Management and Budget's acting director instructed the heads of all executive departments and agencies to effectuate a temporary pause on federal grants, loans, and other financial assistance. That's the OMB memo. Slated to begin the next day, January 28th, 2025 at 5 p.m., the funding pause applied to 1, the issuance of new awards, 2, the disbursement of federal funds under all open awards, and 3, any other relevant agency actions that may be implicated by Trump's executive orders. Ms. Brugman, what did this memo mean for the organizations in the Freedom Network, and also what was the immediate response to this memo by members of your organization?
The response to the memo was widespread fear, confusion, frustration. Organizations, the funding that is issued by the federal government is reimbursement funding. So by cutting off the funding with such little notice, not only were people not able to determine whether they'd be able to continue serving folks going forward, but also weren't sure they were going to be paid the money that they were already due from the federal government. So immediately people within our network had to lay off staff and stopped accepting new clients, denying services and support to the very victims that we've been talking about this morning. And that includes legal services, housing, case management, assistance through the legal process to clear their criminal records. All of these services were immediately in great peril.
Thank you. How did your executive director of the Freedom Network anticipate this memo would affect victims and survivors of human trafficking?
Well, what we know is that when programs are not available, victims are stuck with nowhere to go. They stay with their traffickers. They're not able to access safe housing, alternative jobs, food, shelter, medical and mental health services, substance abuse services, all of the critical services that they need in order to leave the trafficking situation, heal, and then if they're pursue justice, either through a civil case or in working with law enforcement. Without those services and support, they remain in the traffickers' orbit and continue to be abused and exploited.
Let me ask, does your organization encourage prostitution or open borders? And please explain your position and why.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. We do not promote any form of work. What we promote are human rights. All workers deserve human rights. No one should be criminalized for the work that they do, either because they have no other choice or because it's the work that they choose. There is a full spectrum of reasons why people do any type of work. Not everyone is as privileged as myself to choose to do legal work in a safe office. For those who are left with choices that are less safe, we have to improve their safety. That is the approach we take to all other sectors of the workforce, and we should take that same approach with sex work as well. Improve the safety.
The Bipartisan Trafficking Victims Protection Act was first signed into law by President Clinton in 2000 and has since been reauthorized a number of times. Can you please explain how and why the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was first developed?
Absolutely. At the time in the 90s, there were a host of cases of forced labor and sex trafficking that involved a lot of extreme psychological coercion. The laws we had on the books at the time did not recognize these types of forced fraud and coercion. At the same time, there were no programs for the survivors. And so they were trapped within the trafficking situation. Many trafficking victims are living with their traffickers. And so leaving the trafficker means needing a safe place to live. And so in recognizing both that survivors needed better services in order to rebuild their lives and to engage with the legal system, the TVPA was created to accomplish both of those
I
goals.
have one more question for you. Where do any gaps in services to victims and providers exist, if there are any, and how could legislation effectively address those gaps?
There are many
Young lady's
gaps.
time has expired, but you may answer the question.
Thank you so much. There are many gaps remaining. We need more funding. We need more support. We need to be allowed to really identify communities most at risk and direct our programs specifically to their needs, to their experiences, and to their situation. We need more housing, medical care, mental health care, case management services are always critical.
Mr. Chairman, I have a unanimous consent request. I ask for unanimous consent to enter into the record a research brief from the ACLU titled, "Is Sex Work Decriminalization the Answer?" What the research tells us, a comprehensive review of more than 80 studies on the decriminalization and criminalization of sex work, which revealed there is no clear
Okay,
link
so
between
you
criminalizing
can
sex work and
do
stopping human
yours,
trafficking.
but if you want to read from it like I did, next time you need to do it in your 5 minutes, which is what I did. So we're going to go with Mr. Tiffany for 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Cooper, how can social media companies help? You know, I view, especially with young males, that pornography is kind of a gateway drug to stuff like this that happens, how could the social media companies help? And have you identified ways that they could be to stem the tide of this proliferation?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. It's a great question. Under our current legal framework in the United States, social media companies have to report CSAM that they find on their networks, but only if they see it. So they don't have to proactively look for it, and I think that proactive detection is probably the most significant action that technology companies could take in this country to look for the material and then remove it. So that would be the first thing. The second thing is a lot of the social media companies like Meta provide encryption on their services like WhatsApp. And WhatsApp, CSAM is proliferating across that particular application because it's encrypted and it provides safe harbor for pedophiles all over the world.
Have any states taken action? First of all, I'm not sure the legality. Can they have any states taken action in this regard?
Some of the states are looking at things like age assurance and age verification issues to be able to block content for minors. But then some states are looking at ways to be able to sort of block the efforts of the Internet Crimes Against Children task forces by preventing them from being able to collect what's called attribution data in their investigations. So you kind of have both things happening at the state level. It's a bit of patchwork. So we have some laws that have been passed, like in Utah, that have problems. And we have some laws that are passed in other states that are working towards like age verification.
Thank you. Ms. Lopez, is prostitution a component of human trafficking in your experience?
Well, it is a result of being trafficked. It's not a choice by the victim.
But it's a component of human trafficking.
It is, absolutely,
Is that right?
because somebody is paying for a service.
Yeah. Is it helpful to your cause to encourage prostitution?
No,
It is not helpful.
to encourage prostitution.
Yes. That does not help
No.
to limit human trafficking. Is that right?
Well, if you're saying that prostitution is okay, it opens the door for anybody to say, okay, well, I'm going to say this child who's 17, but looks like they're 21, let's go ahead and prostitute them, and we're not going to be held liable.
So in other words, legalizing prostitution is not going to be helpful to your cause.
No, not at all.
Ms. Basham, are you familiar with something referred to as rape trees? Microphone.
No, not extensively.
Okay, so when I was down to Arizona on one of the trips with Mr. Biggs, an Arizona sheriff shared how the gangs, if I recall this correctly, they would hang a woman's underwear when they would bring her in from a foreign country and when they were trafficked into the United States. Those were rape trees. I'm sorry to have to share it in such explicit terms, but is it helpful to secure the southern border to prevent some human trafficking in the United States of America?
Well, let me give you this analogy. If you take excellent care of your children in your house, you are going to lock your door at night. And I believe very firmly that, first of all, a lot of these children, we know this now, we are not in the dark. They are being raped along the journey here. It's a horrific set of circumstances that they are facing here. And by having porous borders, what it actually ends up doing is it becomes a push-pull factor, and it actually encourages this. The biggest thing with human trafficking in general is it's a crime. It's very different than every other human rights abuse because it's not just slavery. It is slavery, but human trafficking is actually at its core part of the advanced criminal networks. And that's why it's such a big deal, and it is part of this committee explicitly. So yes, I absolutely believe that every country needs to have authority over their borders, and I believe that there should be no incentivization for someone to try to cross those borders, because otherwise what you get is you get children who are caught in the middle and they become the commodity.
So securing our borders will help prevent human trafficking.
Absolutely.
I yield back.
Thank you. We've been called to votes. I think there's just one vote. I would urge us to go over vote quickly and come back I'm trying to poll, see who's available to come back. I think most everybody can. So I'd ask the witnesses to stay close. we're going to go into recess until 10 minutes after the vote. So probably 20 to 30 minutes, somewhere in there. So with that, we're going to be in recess.
Okay, thank you.
I've never had that. I was like, have you had that before? I've never had that happen.